Welcome to Informatica Cloud 101 on-demand course. In this module, we will talk about the mapping task and mapping parameters. After completing this module, you will be able to explain the purpose of mapping task, create, test, and run a mapping task, parameterize a mapping, and understand how changes to mapping affect mapping task. The mapping task allows you to process data based on the data flow logic defined in a mapping. When you create a mapping task, you select the mapping for the task to use. Mappings are created in the Cloud Mapping Designer within Informatica Cloud. When you create a mapping task, you also define parameters associated with the mapping. A mapping can also include parameters, but they are not required. When you create a mapping task, the first thing you will be promoted to do is select the mapping to use for the task. The selected mapping determines what wizard will look like and how many tabs or steps will be included. When you create a mapping task, you can also do things like schedule the task or add pre- and post-processing commands. You can also use user-defined parameters in mapping tasks. There are a few things to know about mapping tasks. 1. They can be downloaded and imported into PowerCenter. 2. They can be invoked via the REST API. 3. They can also be scheduled or invoked via a Salesforce outbound message. I will now demonstrate how to create a mapping configuration task from a mapping created in the earlier module. I will also show you how to configure the task to run on a schedule. In this demo, we will create a mapping task and see how to assign a schedule to the task. Log into the Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services and select the Data Integration Service. To create a new asset, click New on the navigation pane. As the Mapping Task option is selected by default, click the Create button. The new Mapping Task page appears. In the Task Name field, enter the task name and keep the location set to default. From the Runtime Environment drop-down, select the Active Secure Agent group. To select the mapping for the mapping task, click the Select button. From the Select a Mapping window, select a mapping and click Select. Click Next to assign a schedule. From the Schedule Details section, we can select the option as per our requirement. We can also define email notifications, pre- and post-processing commands, and a parameter file for a mapping task. To save and close the mapping task, click Finish. This concludes the demo. Now that I have discussed the mapping task, I am going to talk about adding parameters to a mapping. There are various use cases for adding parameters to a mapping. You may want to parameterize the source and/or target connections for a mapping. This would allow you to reuse the same mapping to load data into or extract data from your development, test, and production environments. In this example, you would create multiple mapping tasks using the same mapping. This makes your mapping more flexible, allowing business users to easily specify values without having to edit the mapping. For example, you might create a mapping that extracts account data from Salesforce, but want to allow your business users to specify what type of account data. When they create a mapping task based on the mapping, they can specify filters on the account type, account geography, and so on. By using parameters in a mapping, you can create more flexible mapping. Any aspect of a mapping can be parameterized, including the source connection and source object or objects, the target connection, target object, and field mapping. Note that the target supports full or partial parameterization of the field mapping, the join condition, the filter criteria, the lookup connection, lookup object, and lookup condition, as well as any expressions. Now let's see what is a parameter. A parameter is essentially a placeholder for a value or values in a mapping. A user defines the value of a parameter within the mapping task. The table lists the parameters that you can create in each transformation. I will also talk about how those parameters are then configured in a mapping task. For a source transformation, you can parameterize the source connection. You can also limit the connection type for the parameter or allow any connection type. In the task, you select the connection to use. You can also parameterize the source object. Then in the task, you select the source object to use. For the expression transformation, you can parameterize the entire expression. In the task, you can specify the expression. For the filter transformation, you can parameterize the filter condition, including the field name and field value. In the task, you select the incoming field to use, as well as specify the value. For the lookup transformation, you can parameterize the lookup connection. You can limit the connection type for the parameter or allow any connection type. In the task, you can then select the connection to use. You can also parameterize the lookup object. In the task, you can select the lookup object to use. You can also parameterize the lookup condition, including the lookup field and the incoming field. In the task, you select the field in the lookup and field in the data flow to use. For the joiner transformation, you can parameterize the join condition. In the task, you define the entire join condition. You can also parameterize the master and/or detail fields in the join condition. In the task, you would then select the field in the detail source to use. For the target, you can parameterize the target connection. You can limit the connection type for the parameter or allow any connection type. In the task, you select the connection to use. You can also parameterize the target object. In the task, you select the target object to use. Finally, for the target, you can also parameterize a field mapping, either partially or fully. If fully parameterized, in the task, you configure the entire field mapping. If partially parameterized, you configure the field mappings that you want to enforce in the mapping. Then in the task, you can configure the rest of the field mappings. The target fields mapped in the mapping do not display in the task. For all transformations, you can also parameterize field rules. You can create parameters for named fields. In the task, you then select the field to use in the field rule. You also create a parameter for the pattern to be used when renaming fields in bulk. In the task, you will enter the regular expression to use as the pattern. There are various parameter types. The type of parameter determines how the parameter will display in the mapping task wizard. A string parameter represents a string value that is used as entered. In the task, the parameter displays as a text box in most instances. A connection parameter represents a connection. You can specify the connection type for the parameter or allow any connection type. In the task, the parameter displays as a list of connections. If the connection type was limited to a certain type, then the list of connections will be limited to only connections of that type. An expression parameter represents an expression. In the task, the parameter displays the field expression dialog box. A data object parameter represents a data object, such as a source table or source file. In the task, the parameter displays as a list of available objects from the selected connection. A field parameter represents a field. In the task, the parameter displays as a list of available fields from the selected object. A field mapping parameter represents a field mapping. You can create a full or partial field mapping. In the task, the parameter displays a field mapping screen. Full field mappings display all available fields. Partial field mappings display only unmapped target fields. The parameter panel displays all parameters in the mapping. You can view details about the parameter and the transformation where the parameter is used. You can create a parameter in the parameter panel or in the location where you want to use the parameter. Note that once you create a parameter, you cannot edit it. Create parameters as needed. When you create a parameter in the parameter panel, you create any type of parameter. In a transformation, you can create the type of parameter that is appropriate for that property. Let's see some best practices here. To configure a mapping with a connection parameter, configure the mapping with a specific connection. Then you can select the source, target, or lookup object that you want to use and configure the mapping. After the mapping is complete, you can replace the connection with a parameter without causing changes to other mapping details. When you use a parameter for an object, use parameters for all conditions or field mappings in the data flow that use fields from the object. When you create a parameter, be sure to enter a clear and concise label. Remember that the label displays in the mapping task and can assist users in entering the right data. You should also consider entering a description for the parameter. The value entered in the description field will display as a tooltip when the user places the mouse over the Help icon. If you make changes to a mapping that is being used by mapping tasks, you must deploy your changes to have the task use the updated mapping. After you update a mapping used in mapping task, you have the following choices. You can save your changes as a new mapping. You should use this option when you want to keep the previous versions of the mapping and related mapping task. Or you can save your changes and deploy the mapping to mapping task. Use this option when your changes are compatible with the existing task. Note that you might need to edit the task to verify that they are valid with the new version of the mapping. You can always view the last deployed version of the mapping. I will now demonstrate how to add parameters to a mapping, how to review the status of mapping tasks that use the mapping, and then finally, how to deploy mapping changes to mapping tasks. In this demo, we will add parameters to a mapping, review status of the mapping task, and deploy mapping changes to the mapping task. Log into the Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services and select the Data Integration Service. Click Explore and select the default project. For a mapping, click on the Actions icon. From the drop-down, select Copy to option. From the Copy to window, select the Project 1 project and click Select. In the Project 1 folder, for the selected mapping, click on the Actions icon. From the drop-down, select Rename. In the Rename Asset window, rename the mapping and click Save. Go to the Edit mode for the mapping, Multi-Target Parameters. To add a parameter to the first filter condition, select the filter transformation, FIL Root High Probability Opportunities. In the Filter Properties pane, click Filter. Click on the value 70 in the Value column. And from the drop-down, select New Parameter. In the New Input Parameter window, specify the details as shown on the screen and click OK. To save and continue working, click Save. To add a parameter to the second filter condition, select the filter transformation, FIL Root Low Probability Opportunities. In the Filter Properties pane, click Filter and click on the value 70 in the Value column. From the drop-down, select New Parameter. In the New Input Parameter window, specify the details as shown on the screen and click OK. Click Save to save and continue working. To create a new mapping task directly from the mapping, click the Actions icon and select the New Mapping Task option. In the Task Name field, enter the name and keep the location set to default. From the Runtime Environment drop-down, select the Active Secure Agent group and click Next. In the Input Parameters tab, enter the values as shown on the screen. To validate the template and parameters, click Validate. As the mapping is valid, Click Finish to save and close the Mapping Task wizard. To run the mapping task, click Run. To verify that the task has completed successfully, open the High Probability Opportunities.csv file. Observe that the correct opportunities are written to the file. Now we will completely parameterize the filter conditions to make the mapping even more flexible. To edit the mapping, go to the Edit mode for the mapping, Multi-Target Parameters. Select the filter transformation, FIL Root High Probability Opportunities, and click Filter in the Filter Properties pane. From the Filter Condition drop-down, select Completely Parameterized. To create a new parameter, click the New Parameter button. In the New Input Parameter window, specify the details as shown on the screen and click OK. Similarly, select the Filter Transformation FIL Root Low Probability Opportunities and click Filter in the Filter Properties pane. From the Filter Condition drop-down, select Completely Parameterized. To create a new parameter, click the New Parameter button. In the New Input Parameter window, specify the details as shown on the screen and click OK. To save and continue working, click Save. From the navigation pane, click Explore. Select the project where the mapping task is saved. To run the mapping task, from the Actions menu drop-down, select Run. The task fails because the mapping task is incompatible with the current version of the mapping. We must edit the task and provide values for the new parameters in the mapping. From the navigation pane, click Explore. Go to the Edit mode of the mapping task and go to the Input Parameters step. For the Target 1 filter condition parameter, click the New button. Review the opportunity data in Salesforce and consider how you might route data to the target files. Update the filters as shown on the screen. Run the mapping task. To verify that the task has completed successfully, open the High Probability Opportunities.csv file and verify that the correct opportunities are written. This concludes the demo. This module has 3 labs. In the first lab, you will build a mapping task and schedule the task to run on a regular basis. In the second lab, you will copy an existing mapping and add parameters for source connection and object. You will also add parameters for filter condition. In the third lab, you will add a completely parameterized filter condition and deploy mapping changes to a mapping task. This concludes Module 13. This module showed you how to create a mapping task, add parameters to a mapping, and deploy changes to a mapping task.